Welcome to this episode of the Leading in Dentistry podcast. I'm Dr. Wes Eggett. After spending the last 20 years in a variety of leadership positions, and as a student of leadership myself, I started Leading in Dentistry to share what I found and to continue learning with you. If anything from this episode stands out, check out the show notes, our online courses, or one-on-one coaching on leadingindentistry.com. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Leading in Dentistry podcast. I'm Dr. Wes Eggett. For those of you new to the podcast, I'm a practicing associate dentist just outside of Denver, Colorado, and I started Leading in Dentistry to help develop the leadership skills of each team member in the dental office, not just the business owner. And I started this podcast specifically while I'm not an owner of any dental practice, as I really want to get across the message that you don't need to wait until you're in charge to be a leader. Now, this episode of the podcast is being released the day after Martin Luther King Day, and I wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to discuss communication skills because Martin Luther King was a great communicator and is known for arguably one of the best-known speeches of all time, which is the I Have a Dream speech. But there's a story behind that speech that is a little bit different than what most people remember. So he actually came prepared that day to give a different speech entirely. He had the scripted message in front of him, and he was reading from that message. And I'm not sure if the message wasn't landing the way that he wanted or if it didn't have the same oomph behind it that he had hoped for. But there was one lady that was on the stand just behind him. I think she was sitting in the choir. Her name was Mahalia Jackson. And as Martin Luther King is going through and reading his scripted message, she speaks up and says, "Tell him about your dream." And so from then, he put away his scripted message and he started sharing the I Have a Dream speech. So it was something that he had talked about before, but not in the same way. And for some reason on that day, the way that it hit became one of the most well-known speeches of all time. And it's obviously one of the things that he's most well known for. And because he was such a great communicator, I wanted to take some time to figure out how can we take the message of that story and become good communicators ourselves? What type of things do we need to do in leadership in order to get across a specific message? And I wanted to focus on this because it's something that a lot of people struggle with. If you are a new leader or if you are wanting to take more ownership over your position or even experienced leaders, they often get confused thinking that public speaking is about charisma or that leadership is about public speaking to begin with, when really it's not. It's not about public speaking, but you do have to be able to communicate. You have to be a good communicator whether or not you're a good public speaker. And the difference is with leadership, it's all about taking an image or a vision or a goal that's in your mind and being able to convey that to other people that will then come along for the ride. Being able to take the ideas that you have and then help other people buy in and understand your vision to the level that they can help execute on it and help make it a reality, even when you're not there to do it yourself. That is leadership in a nutshell, right? And there are a couple things that I think from this story, but also from communication in general, that really help dial in how to be a good communicator. So the first is to know what your goal is. The second is to know what your audience is or know who your audience is. And then the third is to craft your message. And a lot of times we just skip straight to the craft your message, right? We have something that needs to get done and then we just start speaking without really having any plan. But if you know what your goal is and you know who your audience is, then it makes crafting your message so much easier. It takes away the guesswork. So the first thing I wanted to focus on is know your goal. So a couple of questions you can ask yourself here. What's the primary objective of your message? What are you trying to accomplish? What key outcome do you want your audience to achieve after talking with you or hearing you speak? If you know what this is, you have a North Star of what you're trying to reach for. And no matter what gets thrown in your way along the way to that goal, you're able to reorient yourself because you know what you're trying to accomplish. I have an uncle who is a teacher, and he had an evaluator come and evaluate his teaching one day. And he told me the story, and this is one of the biggest things that he learned through his time in teaching. And as the evaluator was sitting in the back of the room, he was so focused on his words and focused on saying the right thing and not saying the wrong thing. And he said he didn't feel like he did a great job teaching that day. And he realized the reason that it was such a struggle for him is he was focused on trying to impress the person that was sitting in the back of the room. And that person gave him some feedback to not necessarily focus on him as the evaluator, but focus on the students. And so the next time the evaluator came in, he focused on the students. What was the lesson for the day? What did he want the students walking away understanding? And when he did that, he was able to get around the nerves and get around some of the things that were mentally blocking him from getting his message across, because he was focused on the students. He was focused on what the goal was, right? So that leads us into the second idea there, is knowing your audience. So he knew what his goal was. He wanted this lesson to get across, this important message, but then he had to know who his audience was. So who were these students that he was talking to, right? So let's get into that second point. So the first is know your goal. The second is know your audience. So some of the questions you should ask yourself when you're trying to convey a message is, who is your audience? What are their primary concerns or interests? So with Martin Luther King, he knew that he had civil rights activists in the audience. He had allies from diverse backgrounds, people that were had the ability to implement change and also be a voice for change. And if he could help them understand what his goal was, then he could multiply his influence through that medium. And then also when you're trying to figure out who your audience is, think about like the cultural and demographic factors that will affect what your message will end up being. So a good example of this is the time that I spent in the military. So when I was in the U.S. Army, I was stationed at a clinic that only had a few military soldiers there, but the vast majority of the people on staff were all civilian staff. So I would say we probably had 4 or 5 soldiers, but our staff was like 26 or 30 or something like that. It was a pretty decent sized clinic. And the thing that happens with military is we move all the time. So every 3-ish years, the entire leadership would turn over, and then new leaders would come in, and the civilians that were working there had to endure all these leadership changes. And in talking with them, one of the things that was most difficult for them was that the military would just try to treat the civilians like they were military too. They didn't have a good understanding of what it was like to speak to a civilian as a civilian instead of as a military member. And in not understanding who the audience was, a lot of the leadership would miss out on little things they could do in order to connect better with the civilians and really get inside their head. And I think there were a lot of lessons that I learned from a lot of mistakes during my time overseeing that clinic. But one of the things that really hit home for me was this ability to connect with civilians as them being civilians. And a couple of things that really humanized everyone during that time was the experience with COVID and us all being, going through the same struggle together. That was something that really helped put us on the same plane. But one of the big takeaways from my time in that leadership position was connecting with the people where they are and understanding who that audience was. And when I was able to do that, then it made every message that was the same message that people had shared before, the same message that people would share after. It made everything just go a lot smoother because we were working as a team because I knew who the audience was. Just a quick interruption here. If you are gaining some value from this podcast, if you enjoy it in any way, if you think someone else could benefit from it, then go ahead and share this with a friend, share it with your team, share it with a colleague. It really helps support the show. Now let's get back to it. So when you have an understanding of who your audience is, it does the same thing for you as knowing what your goal is. It gives you a North Star as you're sharing your message to keep coming back to, because you understand the principles and the foundation of the message you're trying to share. The third step is to craft your message. This is when we're going to figure out what types of words we're going to use, what tone, what style. Is it going to be more lighthearted? Is it going to be more serious? Those are the types of things you'll figure out as you craft that message. But when as you're crafting your message, this is the part where people get tripped up. You'll come in and use the wrong words, or you'll feel like you're getting off track. But if you understand what your goal is and who your audience is, then you can start to reorient. So a good example of this going wrong is one time when I was in a meeting with my team and I was trying to help them understand the framework presented by Patrick Lencioni, where he talks about the ideal team player. He says the ideal team player has a few different characteristics. They are hungry, they are humble, and they are smart. So they're hungry, they have a sense of drive. They're humble. So with their humility, they don't think of themselves as the star player. They think of themselves as contributing to the team. And then also they're smart. So they have a sense of people smarts. And I'm sharing this message, and one of the team members raised her hand. And when I was talking about the role of humility, she says, "You mean we have to be humiliated in order to be a good team member?" And at that moment, and she was very serious. She was very concerned about the message, and I realized then that I didn't understand the audience, that they didn't have a basic understanding of, what humility was, and had never been introduced to the term humility. And for me, that was such a basic thing that I've talked about through, growing up in a religious setting and things like that. But that wasn't something that was familiar to this staff member. And so I realized then that I didn't understand who my audience was. And from that day forward, working with that team, I had to adjust my message, and I had to craft my messages with a different audience in mind than what I had originally anticipated. And so it allowed me from then on to craft my message with a sense of understanding tone, style, and word choice and the role of those. And so while I was thrown off guard in how I crafted my message, and I showed that I didn't really understand my audience, I did have an understanding of what my goal was, what my primary objective was. And I was able to, in the moment, reorient my message and recraft it, or craft it in a different way for the audience that I now understood a little better. And I was still able to accomplish what the goal was out of that discussion. Whenever I do any sort of teaching or speaking in front of a group, the big thing I always ask myself is, what is the one thing I want people to walk away understanding? Or what is the one takeaway I want people to have when they leave this discussion? And if I can answer that, going back to what my goal is, that's huge. The understanding your audience is a bonus, because it helps you understand then how to craft your message. And knowing your audience and crafting your message are very important to becoming a master of communication. But the big thing of knowing your goal, it's going to help you reorient. Like that story from my uncle, of understanding that his goal was to help people walk away with X, Y, or Z after they left that class, and everything else just became so much easier. So this style of communication is more based on principles. It's not necessarily based on flair. It's not based on skill, but it's based on the principle of understanding what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And if you have that as your North Star, you can mix up your words. You can accidentally say or like more than you want. Because at the end of the day, you're focused on what that message is and what that relationship is and what you're trying to get across to the other person. And anything that happens along the way, it's going to work out. And something that people really need to understand, this is a little bonus tip, is that people are rooting for you to succeed. Not many people that you interact with are hoping for you to fail, are hoping for you to mess up your words. People are on your team, and they're looking for ways to understand what it is that you're saying. So if you sit down in a conversation with someone, or if you're in front of a group of people and you do these three things: first, know what your goal is. Second, know who your audience is. And then finally, craft your message. If you do those things, you're going to be a much better communicator, much more skilled communicator than you think. You have it in you, and you'll be able to reach those goals and accomplish translating what your vision is into the minds of other people, so that your team can enact the things that you're trying to achieve. So with that in mind, always be leading and always be learning. We'll see you next time. And that's it for this episode of the Leading in Dentistry podcast. If you learned something today, please leave a 5-star review and share the episode with a friend. If you're ready to take the next step for yourself or provide leadership training for a team member, visit leadingindentistry.com to check out our online courses and one-on-one coaching.